Hello everybody and welcome to this, the 9th Castlevania Symphony of the Night Developer's Diary. In this video we're going to return to the topic of Shadow and Highlights mode, but this time on the backgrounds rather than the sprites. To those of you who missed out on the Sprite-based Shadow and Highlight effect video last year, don't worry, I will provide a link to that in this video. But for the rest of you, you may remember that we managed to achieve some pretty nifty effects, such as this pseudo-transparent skull here. Now, one of the drawbacks to sprite-based Shadow and Highlight mode was that we couldn't use one sprite to cast a shadow or a highlight onto another sprite. Now, in this circumstance where we have one enemy with Alucard, that wouldn't be a big deal anyway, because in the game they would have some kind of collision code, so one won't be appearing in front or behind the other anyway, they'll just collide with each other. But if we want to do some environmental effects such as fire or some fog and some clouds, and we wanted to use some sprites for that, then obviously it would be a problem. It would be pretty immersion breaking if the player sprite disappeared behind or just fully appeared in front of those. Fortunately, the background version of Shadow and Highlight mode doesn't have this issue, and any effect we create, any beam of light, will have an effect on both the background behind it as well as any sprites. I have rather cheekily called this 16-bit ray tracing as a result of this, because it does affect the entire environment with the lights, but obviously, just like sprite-based Shadow and Highlight mode, it does have its limitations, and that's what we will be looking at in this video. But before we get stuck into the main topic, first we have two small pieces of news. To kick things off, we have the very first Symphony of the Night track for 2022, Requiem for the Gods by Engelbart. Those of you familiar with the game will recognise it as the music from the Royal Chapel area. I think that this was a particularly difficult one for the hardware, just because it has this choir singing a chant or a chorus all the way throughout the track. But luckily Engelbart has done a great job. He's found a nice synth sound to substitute for that chorus, and it sounds really fantastic. The whole tune just has this very melancholic, slightly spooky feel to it, but don't take my word for it. I will provide a link in the video so you can go and take a listen for yourselves. There'll be more to come from Engelbart in the future, but for the next few weeks he's going to be resting up as he recovers from his surgery, so if you do pop over to his channel, then maybe leave a message, a get well soon message. I'm sure he'd appreciate it. In the second and final piece of news, I have created a Chinese language version of this channel. And if you're wondering why I would do that, well, the thing is,
years ago, I was Chinese.
Okay, that was just a little joke for you Dreamcast fans out there. I have never been Chinese to the best of my knowledge, maybe in a past life, who knows, but the real reason for making a Chinese language channel is that I've always been interested in travelling and studying foreign languages, and Chinese has been one of those, and I realised last year that I hadn't actually spoken it. I've been doing lots of reading and watching movies and TV and YouTube channels, but I haven't actually spoke it at all in 2021, so a New Year's resolution for 2022 was to speak some more Chinese, and what better way to improve your speaking skills than to put it out there on YouTube as part of the channel. So for any Chinese language speakers watching, or for anyone just curious about how bad my Chinese is, you can go over there and check it out. The content won't be any different from what I'm posting here. Obviously it's a few months behind, so don't worry, you won't be missing out anything by sticking with the English language channel. It's just a little side hobby for me to improve my Chinese. One little interesting thing to come out of this was the Asian Japanese box art I mocked up as part of the thumbnail for that first video. I'm really not much of a graphic designer. I just spent a little while creating it in Sprite, which is the program I use to do the graphics for the game, but I think it turned out not so bad, apart from that rather dodgy Maria painting, which I've always thought was a bit weird. Okay, now let's get back to Shadow and Highlight. I've already shown you a Castlevania Bloodlines-like effect, but now let's get a bit creative and see what other kind of effects we can create. Now if we were going to do a light source from above, normally, realistically speaking, it's going to start narrow at the top and then spread out as it gets to the bottom, so let's try and implement this kind of light cone on the foreground. Now we could add other regular foreground elements, but to keep things simple we're going to stick with the shadow and highlight only, and for the background we're going to choose a Street Fighter 2 stage. And this is the result, with a very hyped up looking Ryo about to do battle with a very calm looking Alucard. Now I had to scale up the Alucard sprite a bit because the original was obviously too small, but it looks a bit weird, but it doesn't look too bad. Maybe in some time in the future I'll do the Castlevania Street Fighter 2 crossover, but for now it's just a little example. There are two things wrong with the shadow and highlight effect in this scene. One of them is to do with the light cone and the other one's to do with Ryo. So have a quick look and see if you can see what they are. If we take a close look at Ryo first, then you'll notice that especially the part where he has a bit of colour on his skin, the brightest part where the light's hitting, and that's not really being shadowed in the area where it should be shadowed. If you look at his feet and look at his right arm, you can see that that bright pink colour is pretty much the same intensity whether it's in the light or whether it's in the shadow, which is obviously a bit wrong. It's not the effect we're looking to get. Now the reason this happens is that the 15th colour in any palette for a sprite is not affected by the shadow and highlights mode, so it just keeps its normal regular colour. So you can see it listed as number 14 here because remember we start counting from 0, so 14 is the 15th colour of the palette. The solution to this is actually pretty simple. We can simply choose a colour, for example black, which isn't really going to change its colour whether it's in shadow or not, because black's just black. It's not, you can't get any darker than black. So we can switch that and make black the 15th colour in the palette, and as you can see here, once we put it in, it looks great now. Should we consider this as a bug in the hardware or is this a feature of the hardware? Well, I think it might be a feature because if you think about it, in some circumstances you might want to keep one colour which doesn't change. So for example, in Castlevania, maybe we're doing some kind of a demon, you want to make his eyes red and you want his eyes to still glare red even if they're in the shadow, it looks very spooky. Or maybe if you have like a robot character, you'll want maybe the lights on the robot to remain very bright even in the shadow area. So I think it might be a feature, and as you just saw there, we can always just put a black in as the 15th colour of the palette and the problem's fixed. And I think that most sprites probably have a black in there somewhere anyway because it's a very useful colour to use for contrast and so on. So I think it might be a feature rather than a bug. It's quite a useful thing, and when it does cause problems it's very easy to solve anyway. If you haven't managed to spot what the problem in the light cone is yet, I think you'll probably be able to spot it now. It's not coming out quite as we wanted it to. While we wanted it to look like this, when the Mega Drive actually processes it, the end result is more like this. The reason for this is very simple. Whereas the sprite shadow and highlight mode that we looked at in the last video, it works on a per pixel basis, so you can design it so this pixel should be a highlight and this pixel should be in shadow. For the background shadow and highlight mode, unfortunately it works on a per tile basis, so each tile, the minimum size is 8 by 8 pixels, so you're pretty much restricted to these kind of square rectangular shapes. With that being the case, you may be wondering how we achieved this effect from earlier. Obviously they're not exactly rectangular, they're much more at an angle, but we still use the rectangular shapes, but we can alter them using line scrolling. If we start off with this rectangular pattern here, we can then gradually shift the pattern line by line until we get this slanted effect. For those of you who have played, for example, Ranger X, you may recognize this pattern in I think they had spotlights that you could get damaged if you got spotted by them, so this kind of movement is actually not too difficult to do. And of course, if you want to achieve a bloodline style effect, like in the Palace of Versailles, we can simply shift the lines forward ahead of time and then scroll them all at the same time. Okay, now that we've got a pretty good idea about both the benefits and the limitations of this effect, let's see with what kind of use we could put it to in the actual game. When I thought about how potentially beams of light could be used in a Symphony of the Night game, I immediately thought of the underground caverns. I should say straight away that this is a very simple prototype, a 16 color background that I knocked up in literally 2 minutes. So it's obviously a very rushed job. When we come to do this area properly in the game, obviously Pyron will do it and it will take a lot more time and put a lot more colors into the background and so on, but for a quick 2-minute rush job is not too bad. The reason that I've thought of the caverns straight away is because simply they are these very dark sections of the game, but ones which they don't really have a lot of complexity in the background, so it doesn't matter if we sacrifice a few background tiles to do some shadow and highlight effects, so I think it's very good for that. And obviously you have the waterfall later on too, which is going to be very difficult to do, but maybe you could put some lighting here. Now right here we've got the lighting just moving automatically. In the end version of the game I'm thinking of maybe putting a few holes in the ceiling, and from the ceiling you have the light shining through those, and rather than moving the light stationary, then Alucard can just walk through back and through the light, and I think it'll be a nice dark claustrophobic level, and with the music I think it could be quite atmospheric. What you're seeing here is a little experiment I did. I took the line scrolling, so I took the same pattern, just these horizontal stance, but then I did some weird algorithm on the line scrolling. So I'm not sure what you think of it. To me it looks like maybe it could be quite a nice underwater effect if I just refined it a bit, like fast moving water like a whirlwind. I mean, we're not going to have any underwater stages in Castlevania anyway. I don't think anyone likes water stages in the platform game, but I think it's just stuff what I show you. I thought it didn't look too bad. It gave me some ideas for the future, maybe not for this game but for other games maybe. Speaking of strange algorithms and effects, I also did this little thing. Again, I don't think this is going to be very useful for the Castlevania game, but I thought it's pretty cool anyway, maybe for a shoot 'em up or something, but it just shows you the kind of things you can do with this shadow and highlight effect. Something that I did think would be more suitable for a Castlevania game would be a kind of a fog effect or some kind of cloud effect, and I tried to do that using rectangles and then using a little bit of line shifting, line scrolling, just to shift the lines a bit to make it not look completely like a rectangle, which would look a bit bad. But as you can see here, the result here isn't very good, so I scrapped that, but I didn't give up on the fog, and we'll see a few more effects next. For my next fog effect, I created this pattern as the foreground. It looks very blocky from there, but actually once we see it here, once I scroll the lines not just a little bit so that they look like kind of rectangles but slightly altered, but I wanted to alter them a lot to shift the lines around a lot, so it looks like almost like streaky thin bits of fog instead, and I think the effect was a much greater improvement over the original. In this scene, if you look at the plain sky in the upper right hand corner, it doesn't look too good. I think this kind of highlight effect doesn't look good against a plain background, but if you focus on the tower to the left or to the walls and the floor below and Alucard, I think it looks pretty nice once it's against those. So I think if we have a background where we don't have any kind of plain tiles, then I think that this fog effect could look quite nice, so I wanted to try it out on a couple of other backgrounds too. Here it is against a simplified 16 color version of the Colosseum background. And now we're back in the first hallway to try it out here too. These are all just experiments. I don't think in the final game I'll be applying any kind of fog effect in these areas, but if you can think of an area of the castle that you think that maybe could use these like fog effects, or maybe areas of the castle that can use these light beam effects, then let me know in the comments below. For the light beam effects, I think maybe the Royal Chapel could be a good candidate. We just got the music for that this time, and hopefully we'll get round to doing the graphics and tile sets later this year. And you've got the big chapel area with the stained glass windows that has light flooding in on the PlayStation version, but to do it in that way will be quite difficult considering the limitations we have, but I might give it a try and see what we can do. Any other areas? I'm not sure, to be honest. I think that the Sprite's Shadow and Highlight mode is probably going to be more useful than the background one, but it's really nice to have fun with this and play with the creativity, because within those limitations you get really creative and try and achieve new things, so I think it's going to be really fun. Okay, that's about it for today's episode. I hope that this video gave you a better understanding and appreciation for the second part of the Shadow and Highlight mode, the backgrounds version. We'll be returning to Shadow and Highlight mode a bit later this year, once I have the compilation of the best examples of that in commercial Mega Drive games. Games such as Vector Man and Ranger X put the Shadow and Highlight mode to really impressive effects, and hopefully it helps spur some creativity among us as well. Thank you for watching, and until next time,
farewell.